Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, my next guest has a very interesting story to tell, as well as the incredible work he does in highlighting Christian persecution. It's great to be joined in studio today by Monsignor Michael James Nazir-Ali. Monsignor Michael, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You have a very interesting story. You spent most of your adult life as an Anglican bishop and you were recently received into the Catholic tradition. Tell us a little bit about this journey.
Yes, I mean, there are some wonderful things about the Anglican tradition, but gradually I began to feel that there were some lacks that are very important ones for our times. So there is no way, for example, of making decisions that affect everyone to be universally applicable. People just do whatever they like. Whatever decision's been made. Secondly, there is no received teaching anymore to which the faithful can go for guidance. And I think the faithful these days need that in a very fast-changing world. And thirdly, of course, there is no magisterial authority that can intervene. I mean, I'm not looking for interventions all the time, but sometimes the faithful need to be told, this is the way to go and not that. The reason I joined the Ordinariate established by Pope Benedict for Anglicans who wanted to be in full communion with the Holy See was that there are some good things about Anglicanism which Pope Benedict recognized should be preserved and contribute to the wider church. Its liturgical tradition, for example, the tradition of good preaching, studying the Bible in a way that's both critical and reverent, moral thinking that is developed in relation to the wider community and not just the confessional, for example. So I think those are good things that Anglican tradition can contribute to the wider church. But those lacks, I think that it is only the Bishop of Rome who can supply some of those lacks.
How did you navigate the challenges, though? Because, it was so many years that you were in the Anglican tradition. And, of course, much of your work is about dialogue, unity.
Yes.
So how do you navigate that journey that can, I would imagine, in many ways be difficult at times?
Well, the Ordinariate that Pope Benedict has established, as I was saying, is actually an example of what is nowadays called receptive ecumenism. That is to say, the Catholic Church accepts that Anglicans who come into communion with it have something to contribute from their tradition. And I was a member of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission for many years. And the explicit mandate given to that commission by Pope Paul VI and Archbishop Michael Ramsey of Canterbury was to restore sacramental fellowship between the two traditions. Now, we worked very hard at this and produced reports one after the other, agreements about things that were seen to be divisive. But my experience was that as soon as we produced something, some Anglican church somewhere would go and do the opposite. And so our Catholic partners were saying, well, what actually do you believe? Here we are agreeing on the nature of the Eucharist or ministry or authority or the Blessed Virgin Mary or whatever, and then someone else is saying the opposite or doing the opposite. And this can't be indefinitely sustainable when we are talking about unity. So that itself showed me some of the things that are needed, that were lacking.
And then how do you carve a path forward in terms of realizing what your own journey was going to be, but also recognizing, as you say, that there is divisions that still exist, and it's maybe no coincidence that today is a day that we remember hundreds of martyrs who were martyred during the Reformation.
Yes, well, when I was Bishop of Rochester, people were martyred for their opinions on both sides, of course. And so St. John Fisher was Bishop of Rochester, of course, martyred by Henry. and Nicholas Ridley, who was also Bishop of Rochester, martyred on the other side under Mary. So it's a tragic story, and but the story of martyrdom continues. I mean, we think of martyrs during the Reformation era, or perhaps under the Roman Empire, but there have been more martyrs for the Christian faith in the last 100 years than perhaps ever before in history.
And yet, this is a fact that most people would be shocked to hear, because it gets so little attention in the mainstream media. Why is that?
Well, I think sometimes the stories are not well told, sometimes they're not told at all. There are daily martyrdoms in countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and these stories are there to be told. It is for the media to pick them up. I mean, take Iran, for instance, a country I know reasonably well. There have been some stories about people taken prisoner and held hostage, and that's good for the media to expose such stories. But at the same time, in a country like Iran, Christians are regularly imprisoned for their faith. But these stories are never heard on the media, and you wonder why. They're as heartrending, as much human interest, families separated, husbands and wives imprisoned separately, and all of those things. So why not? Why are these stories not told? I think they ought to be told.
How do we get that message out there then?
Well, I think what you are doing is one of the ways in which to get the message across and to make sure that the wider media world, if that's the right term, actually hears and sees what you're doing.
Tell us a little bit about your work, Monsignor, with OXTRAD. What is it and what is work?
Yes, well, OXTRAD really began because church leaders in situations where the church is under extreme pressure was saying to me, help us to develop our leadership, lay and ordained. Because very often in these circumstances, it is the leadership that suffers first. They are the ones who are exiled or imprisoned or even killed in many cases. So I thought that was the right thing to do. I mean, you need certain kinds of cultural and linguistic background to do it, and not everyone has it. And I thought that would be a good way of using whatever modest experience I had. So that is what I've been doing, and it's done at every level. It's sort of developing courses in seminaries. It is preparing people for mission. I supervise some research students who are doing PhDs in areas related to the persecution of Christians and of living as persecuted minorities in heavily pressurized situations. And it's been worthwhile. I mean, if you do that, then other things begin to happen. You can't ignore the human rights and the fundamental freedoms issues that people are facing. And then, I mean, I was asked when I was working with Iranian Christians why I didn't speak up for the Baha'is, who were, of course, persecuted even more severely, are persecuted even more severely. So I had to do something about that. And the Muslims then say, well, you speak up for the Christians, what about the Rohingya? And so, I had to say something and do something about it. I discovered that there were many people in countries like Iraq and Pakistan and Egypt and Iran, young people who had no employment opportunities because they couldn't finish their education or they couldn't enter business. So we had to do something about making sure that people finished professional courses so they could get a job, that they could set up in a small business maybe hairdressing or motorcycle repairs or whatever, to make sure they had enough to do it. Now, that was not how I had originally seen my work, but that is actually where you're led, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of just the scale of persecution, Christian persecution throughout the world, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, a Muslim MP in the UK, a friend of mine, he's a Muslim, he has said that 80% of Christian persecution is in the Islamic world. So I think that is true, and that is not to ignore other kinds of persecution, as in China, for instance, that is still continuing, although Christians are now quite a major component of the Chinese population. And there are countries like Eritrea where there's persecution for other reasons. But we can't ignore what has happened in Iraq, for instance. Aid to the Church in Need has been a major agency working with the church in Iraq, and I've been with them there. And we can't just ignore the decimation of ancient communities. I'm very glad that some Christians are now going back to the Nineveh plains and resettling there, and schools are reopening, churches are reopening, employment opportunities are being created, though a great deal more can be done in that way. But it's still a very serious situation. Syria, I have been to Malula, for instance, an ancient Syrian town where the language of Jesus is still spoken. And I was corrected by the local people in my pronunciation of it. Very glad about, very grateful for. But the churches have been desecrated, monasteries have been destroyed by extremists. And this is repeated all over the world. Nigeria, northern Nigeria, this happens on a daily basis. People are attacked at worship. Priests are killed while they're saying Mass. This kind of thing. And the world has to take notice of this. There cannot be a religion-blind approach, because people are being persecuted as religious communities, whether that is Christians, or whether that is the Baha'i, or the Yazidis, or the Ahmadiyya. There are many such communities. But Christians are by far the most persecuted group in the world today.
There is two elements to this not being to the fore. There's the media, which we've talked about in terms of people not being aware of that fact.
Yeah.
But there's also the political establishment that can choose to ignore it in many Western countries.
Yes.
Have you had much experience or interaction there, Monsignor?
Yes, a great deal. I think there are various reasons for this. One is, certainly in the United Kingdom, there is what you might call a sort of misplaced sense of imperial guilt, which somehow conspires with this idea. This is quite laughable, but in Egypt and Iraq, where Christians are an older presence than anything else, Christians are seen as foreign. Well, how is a Coptic Christian in Egypt foreign? He or she is more Egyptian than, the very word means Egyptian. And similarly, in a country like Iraq, Christians in Pakistan are more native to the country perhaps than some others. So this idea of imperial guilt is very misplaced. And Christian missionaries sometimes cooperated with imperial authorities, that's quite true, but very often they opposed them on questions of forced labor, for instance, of preventing the proclamation of the gospel on their territories, which the East India Company did for many years until they were forced by an act of parliament to allow it. So it's not a straightforward thing. That's one reason. The other is what you might call religious illiteracy, so that people are brought up through their university studies or their formation as diplomats and so on, to think that it's only economic and political factors that matter. But actually we live in a world where religion matters, whether we like it or not, whether we think it's good or bad. I mean, that's another debate. But it does matter. It is a force for decision-making about important things in many countries, most countries, perhaps we should say. And to ignore it is a recipe for disasters, for misreading the situation. I think those are the sorts of reasons why this is ignored.
And there's almost, like you say, a blinkered vision if the persecution's genesis is connected to religion.
Yes.
You know? So how do we take the blinkers off, especially from a political perspective?
Well, that's right. This is why this religion-blind approach is useless, because, I mean, if Yazidis and Christians are being persecuted in Iraq, they are being persecuted because of their beliefs. And to say you're going to take a religion-blind approach to refugees or relief of internally displaced people or human rights issues, well, how are you going to do it unless you take religion into account?
You've been, Monsignor, to some of the countries that you've talked about and seen persecution at the coalface. Tell us about some of those experiences.
What are they like? I mean, well, it's very moving. I mean, I was taken in Malula by the local people to a home which was actually a series of converted caves. That's how people were living, very nicely converted, in the mountains, in the face of the mountain. And we went into one home, and there was a young woman there, about your age, and her blind father. And I was talking to them, and she said that the extremists came to their home. They went to other homes as well. They asked her brothers and a cousin, I think it was, to recite the Islamic profession of faith. When they refused, they were shot. Now, leaving this young woman to look after her blind father, when just before I was due to leave, they asked me to bless the house. Well, what do you do? Well, I did, of course, but you know, this is the kind of tragedy that you come across. In Iran, I mean, Christian leaders I've known have been martyred. I mean, just killed. And then the families are there. I know the families. One of my students at the moment is related to a great martyr in Iran after the Islamic Revolution. And I'm in touch with the family, so you know, we can't ignore these things. Even after an event like a martyrdom takes place, the family then has to live with it for 40, 50 years.
What, in your opinion, and especially, Monsignor, just your work with OXTRAD in trying to face some of these challenges of extremism throughout the world, is the Catholic Church doing enough to face these challenges, you know, on a global scale, but also more locally as well, and what more can be done?
Yeah, the Catholic Church is doing a great deal, but of course it's on the ground, and in some cases the Catholics are the people who are suffering. So in Iraq, it's mainly the Chaldean Catholic Church that has suffered. A Yazidi man said to me in Iraq when I was there with the aid to the Church in Need, he said, your religion shows you how to help us. Our religion doesn't tell us how to do it. Well, that's, you know, that was unsolicited testimony. In Iran, I remember on one occasion when I was there in situation of some danger, we were protected by the presence of the papal nuncio. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. So the Catholic Church is taking up many of these cases. Sometimes it is done quietly, sometimes not so quietly. But I think it's not just the Church. I think the politicians have to step up to the mark. I know the European Parliament, for instance, is now very active on this question of the persecution of Christians and of others. The Church should be, again and again, emphasizing its commitment to freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom to change your beliefs, freedom to express your beliefs in public or in private as you wish. I mean, Article 18 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But of course, these are also questions for dialogue. I think as you said earlier, I've been engaged in dialogue with people of many different faiths. And I don't believe in kissy-kissy dialogue, where you sort of pat each other on the back and say how wonderful.
But it's hollow.
Yeah, well, sort of. Yeah, it doesn't have any consequences. So I think dialogue has to be an occasion when we challenge one another. And of course, Christians can also be challenged about this, no question about it, about our commitment to fundamental human freedoms.
Finally, just to ask you, Monsignor, with your experience, especially of exposing Christian persecution and visiting some of the countries you've visited, some people might think, gosh, how does that affect your own personal faith? Does it challenge it or does it enrich it? What is the impact on you personally?
Well, both. I mean, it does challenge it when you see innocent people suffering for no fault of their own. But it also strengthens it immeasurably. I mean, Asia Bibi, who was imprisoned for, I think, 8 or 9 years in solitary confinement on this charge of blasphemy, she was saying the other day that it was her reading her Bible every day that kept her going. Well, that's a challenge for us.
Yeah, it's what an incredible witness to faith. Thank you so much for joining us
Bless
on
you.
iCatholic today. It's been really lovely to talk with you, Monsignor. And thank you for joining us. And if you want to find out more about the work of Aid to the Church in Need, which Monsignor mentioned several times in our discussion, you can go to acnireland.org.